Welcome to the Daily News Currents. Today is Tuesday, February 26th, and for today's headlines we have 21 Doge staffers resign, saying they won't help dismantle public services. Upheaval and firings at CDC raise fears about disease outbreak response. U.S. and Ukraine agreed to minerals deal, officials say. Detective did jobs for the mafia on the side, prosecutors say. Their album is worthless. Will their protest against AI resound? 21 Doge staffers resign, saying they won't help dismantle public services. A group of 21 career civil servants whose team was folded into Elon Musk's Department of Government Efficiency resigned on Tuesday, writing in a joint letter posted publicly that they refused to use their skills to put American data at risk and dismantle critical public services. The federal workers, mostly software engineers and product managers, were once part of the U.S. Digital Service, which was renamed Doge when Musk launched his initiative from within the White House. The Musk-led unit has laid off thousands of workers and moved to dismantle entire agencies in slash and burn campaign to reduce the size of the government. In the letter addressed to the White House Chief of Staff, Susan Wiles, the government employees wrote that they swore an oath to the Constitution to serve the American people, but that it has become clear that we can no longer honor those commitments at the United States Doge service. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt responded to the 21 Doge workers resigning en masse in a statement. "Don't let the door kick you on the way out," she said. The letter was first reported by the Associated Press. The departure of the 21 career staffers comes as Musk Doge workers spread across vast parts of the federal government and gain access to key data systems in an effort to dig into sensitive federal data and delete entire agencies, as Musk has put it. Over the weekend, Musk prompted widespread confusion after millions of government workers received an email from the Office of Personnel Management asking them to account for what they did in the past week in the form of 5 bullet points. Musk indicated on X, the social media site he owns, that not responding could result in job loss. The OPM message led to panic and chaos as federal agencies gave conflicting advice about whether or not employees should respond. There is pending litigation about whether Musk, as a senior advisor to the president, has a legal authority to make decisions himself. In their Tuesday letter, the Doge employees noted that about 40 staffers in the office were laid off last week. They had been working on improving the technical systems behind Social Security, veteran services, disaster relief, and other government functions. Their removal endangers millions of Americans who rely on these services every day. The sudden loss of their technology expertise makes critical systems and America data less safe, the resigning employees, who did not list their names, wrote in a letter to Wiles. Among the 40 who were terminated earlier this month was Jonathan Cames, a Doge engineer who said he believes he was targeted for publicly endorsing Kamala Harris for president. The U.S. Digital Service spent more than a decade making government better to serve normal, everyday people, Cames told NPR. Elon Musk doesn't care about any of that. All he cares about is seizing power and making his obscene fortune even larger. Musk did not return NPR's request for comment. On January 21st, according to the letter, Musk lieutenants, some wearing White House visitor badges, refused to identify themselves and asked the staffers questions about their political loyalties and technical skills. This process created significant security issues, the group wrote in a letter. Upheaval and firings at CDC raise fears about disease outbreak response. The widespread upheaval at federal health agencies in the first month of the Trump administration comes at a time when the U.S. faces infectious diseases threats on multiple fronts: the ongoing spread of bird flu around the country, the risk of emerging insect-borne viruses, and a ballooning measles outbreak in the Southwest. Abroad, there are new strains of Mpox and deadly outbreaks of Ebola and polio just a plane ride away. Recent mass firings, primarily aimed at new and temporary workers, have thinned the ranks of the workforce that would aid in the response to the outbreaks in the Center of Disease Control and Prevention, according to interviews with more than half a dozen current staff. They requested anonymity because they were not authorized to speak publicly. The situation has infectious disease experts worried. They seem like the worst time to be taking steps to degrade our nation's preparedness, says Dr. David Fleming, a former CDC official who now chairs the agency's advisory committee to the director. They are greatly diminishing CDC and the country's ability to respond to emerging infectious disease threats. Those who work at CDC tell NPR they're deeply concerned about the prospect of future job cuts and the weakening of policies around vaccination. They also caution that restrictions around communication could hamper the agency's response to unfolding outbreaks. The big thing that's impacting us now is the demoralizing work environment, intentional chaos, uncertainty over our jobs, says one CDC staffer. Outbreak responses are very stressful when you have all the available resources. To be an outbreak response now in this climate is a whole new level of complexity and stress. Dr. Deblina Data, an infectious disease physician who retired from the CDC in 2023, says, "This is just a very dangerous period of time for our country because we're addressing threats on multiple fronts. In my 24 years at the CDC, I've never seen the morale hit that is going on right now." In response to the NPR, a spokesperson for the CDC listed several emergency responses that are currently active, such as measles in Texas, influenza A, H5N1, and Mpox, but did not answer other questions about the extent of the layoffs and their impact on the agency's operations. Fleming and other members of the committee sent a letter to Acting CDC Director Dr. Susan Moneres and HA Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. on February 17th, urging them to take immediate action to forestall the impending crisis on our nation's health and safety precipitated by the firings. They haven't responded. Key staff for detecting potential threats fired. The full extent of the cuts remain unclear, although NPR has reported about 750 people were let go from CDC in the first wave of firings earlier this month, and more cuts could be on the way. If we have another round of layoffs, then we really start to feel the pain in a very tangible way, the CDC staffer said. Among those who already lost their jobs, a cadre of scientists who assist local health authorities in detecting diseases, staff who are charged with preventing the introduction of dangerous pathogens from abroad, and some involved in modeling disease outbreaks to get ahead of them, CDC sources said. One of the programs decimated by the cuts, the Laboratory Leadership Service Fellowship, had previously enlisted PhD-trained researchers to pitch in on disease responses for Dengue in American Samoa and Puerto Rico, Marburg virus in New York, and new rabies variant in Nebraska, according to these 3 current CDC employees. In some cases, the fellows are needed to develop lab tests in fast-moving situations. They are the first responders, said another CDC staffer. Without them on the front lines, who will develop these tests? Who will do these tests? In fact, one CDC fellow who received a termination letter had just spent weeks, helping the state of Florida develop a plan for a potential wave of Aropuche this coming summer. Aropuche is a viral disease spread by mosquitoes and midges, and also through sexual contact, caused large outbreaks in South America and the Caribbean last year, leading to birth defects and fetal deaths similar to those caused by the Zika virus. Florida health officials had discerned from testing past samples that cases in their state have gone undetected. The fellow told NPR they were terrified there might be thousands of samples come summer, and that they had to be ready. The pause on communications when Trump took office, however, prevented the fellow from sharing the response plans with the state, and now the plans could languish since the fellow has been let go. The firings also swept up 2 CDC workers, both part of the public health training program, who'd been deployed to work on tuberculosis outbreak in Kansas City, CDC sources told NPR. Another arm of the CDC feeling the pinch of layoffs is the already overstressed team that oversees port health stations, screening travelers for dangerous pathogens at airports and land border crossings. 3 out of the 20 port health stations now have no CDC staff, and half have no officer in charge, according to the current CDC employee, who is not authorized to speak publicly. These stations are the first line of defense. Staff there assess humans and animals for disease threats, and if a case of illness is found, work in local authorities on contact tracing if other passengers were potentially exposed. With countries dealing with outbreaks of Ebola and other diseases, it's critical to have these trained workers in place who can recognize somebody with signs of symptoms and coordinate the response, says Dr. Kimberly Dodd, Dean of the College of Veterinary Medicine at Michigan State University and a former USDA official. Stations are increasingly covering for each other, and sometimes choosing not to do certain things because there aren't enough resources, a CDC employee with direct knowledge of the situation told NPR. It's like a web, and when you rip out part of it, you can't expect it to work the same as before, the individual says. Fears about readiness for emerging risks. It will take time to see the consequences of the cracks introduced by these mass firings and the broader attempt to downsize federal health agencies. The ripple effects and how it impacts our infectious disease and pandemic preparedness is going to be larger and more widespread than we're able to put our arms around right now, said Dodd. Some worry that the ongoing turbulence could distract from some of the most pressing public health threats on our doorstep, including bird flu and measles. Aside from firings, other agency functions have been interrupted. For instance, the CDC forthcoming meeting of its vaccine advisors was postponed, playing into concerns that vaccine policy could be disrupted by the new administration. And the CDC pulled a successful advertising campaign for the flu vaccine amid the worst flu season in years. The clampdown on external communication that took hold when President Trump came into office impeded some lines of communication and frayed long-standing relationships between local health officials, their partners, and the federal government. While routine meeting and updates about bird flu and other urgent threats have resumed to some extent, communication is still not where it needs to be, said Lori Freeman, Executive Director of the National Association of City and County Health Officials. The targeting of the CDC was on the top of mind when Freeman met with Texas health officials last week, amid ongoing fears about the state's measles outbreak. It feels like there's a lot of areas that are threatening our ability to do work on the ground, she says. She adds that she fears the CDC may pull back funds that local public health agencies rely on. Since mid-January, 124 cases of measles have been reported in the South Plains regions of Texas, and 9 cases in neighboring New Mexico. Both states tell NPR that they are in regular contact with their counterparts at the CDC. So far, though, the agency doesn't have a major presence on the ground. We would only request assistance if the state did not have the resources to respond to the outbreak, according to Laura Anton, a spokesperson for the Texas Department of State Health Services, who confirmed that one CDC epidemiologist is in the region. But in the city of Lubbock, where hospitals are caring for patients with measles, some local health officials are calling for more help, whether that's from state or federal authorities. We need some more boots on the ground to be combating this, Catherine Wells, Director of Public Health for the city of Lubbock, told NPR. Robert Knott, a spokesperson for the New Mexico Department of Health, said on the measles front our relationship with the CDC remains productive. Overall, notes data, that former CDC official, disease outbreak response is fundamentally a human-based enterprise. While it depends on data, important information needs to be relayed between epidemiologists, health care providers on the ground, and public health authorities. Those are not automated systems, not by a long shot, said Data, a former CDC official. It takes a practiced eye to say, what are the next set of questions that we need to be asking? How can we confirm or negate our worst fears, says Data. For instance, a few polio cases are reported from different countries over a few months. It would take a bird's eye view to understand how they are related. Knowing where the cases are coming from is key to effectively fighting an outbreak, she says. U.S. and Ukraine agreed to minerals deal, officials say. President Trump, who had insisted he wanted payback for past military aid to Lviv, suggested President Volodymyr Zelensky would visit Washington this week to sign a deal, which he called a very big deal. Ukraine has agreed to turn over the revenue from some of its mineral resources to the United States, an American and Ukrainian official said on Tuesday, in a deal that follows an intense pressure campaign from President Trump that included insults and threats. The final terms of the deals were unknown, and it was not immediately clear what, if anything, Ukraine would receive in the end after days of difficult, sometimes tense negotiations. President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine had repeatedly pressed for security guarantees for his country in exchange for mineral rights as Russia's war had entered its 4th year. Previous draft agreements reviewed by the New York Times included no such security commitment. Mr. Trump had insisted he wanted payback for past military aid to Lviv, shifting Americans' alliance with Ukraine to a nakedly mercantile footing. A final translated draft of the agreement was sent to Ukraine on Tuesday, according to the American official. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent and his Ukrainian counterpart, the American official said, are expected to sign the agreement first, and then Mr. Zelensky is expected to go to Washington for a signing with Mr. Trump. The American and Ukrainian officials insisted in speaking anonymously in order to describe private negotiations. On Tuesday afternoon, Mr. Trump, speaking from the Oval Office in Washington, said of Mr. Zelensky, I hear he's coming on Friday. Certainly it's okay with me if he'd like to, and he would like to sign it together with me. And I understand that's a big deal, very big deal. Mr. Zelensky has been pressing for days to finalize any agreement with Mr. Trump in person, but the Ukrainian leader had rejected at least one other draft of an agreement because it lacked specific U.S. security guarantees, and because Mr. Trump was requesting mineral rights worth $500 billion, along with other provisions that Ukraine considered unacceptable. The Ukrainians became more confident with the deal in the past few days after the Americans removed some of the more onerous conditions. When the final terms of the deal are not clear, a draft agreement discussed on Tuesday no longer included the demand that Ukraine contribute $500 billion to a fund owned by the United States. It also did not include a request that Ukraine pay back the United States twice the amount, on any future American aid, a demand that Mr. Zelensky had comprised to imposing a long-term debt on Ukraine. Instead, the draft agreement said Ukraine would contribute to fund half of its revenues from the future monetization of natural resources, including critical minerals, oils, and gases. The United States would own their maximum financial interest in the fund allowed under American law, though not necessarily all, and the fund would be designated to reinvest some revenues into Ukraine. The United States would also commit to supporting Ukraine's future economic development. The discussions about mineral rights have occurred as Russia has seized the advantage on the battlefield. Mr. Trump has also aligned himself with President Vladimir Putin while exonerating Mr. Zelensky. Mr. Trump has called the Ukrainian president a dictator and falsely said that Ukraine had started the war, although the conflict began with Russia's full-scale invasion in February 2022. He has prodded Mr. Zelensky to sign a deal, saying he better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. In response, Mr. Zelensky said Mr. Trump was trapped in a Russian disinformation bubble. A testament to Mr. Trump's transactional approach to foreign affairs, the deal follows similar moves by the American president to leverage the United States' economic power and pressuring allies like Canada and Colombia to comply with or at least negotiate on his demands. Critics say a previous draft on the deal gave no consideration to the cost in lives that Ukraine has already paid towards Europe's broader security by defending Russia's initial invasion, preventing a Russian military presence on NATO borders farther west, and by grinding down Moscow's army over 3 years of fierce fighting. Mr. Zelensky floated the idea of a resources deal last fall to provide an incentive for more U.S. military support, but he balked at the terms presented by the Trump administration when Mr. Bessent visited Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, on February 12th. "I'm not signing something that 10 generations of Ukrainians will have to repay," he told in a news conference. Still, the Ukrainian leader acknowledged that he might ultimately have little choice. "We are forced, and we cannot do without it. Then we should probably go for it," he said, amid intensifying pressure. The White House has argued that even without specific security guarantees, the mere pressure of American economic interest in Ukraine would deter further Russia aggression. "What better could you have for Ukraine than to be in an economic partnership with the United States?" Mike Waltz, the U.S. National Security Advisor, said last week. Detectives did job for the mafia on the side, prosecutors say. Hector Rosario, a Nassau County detective, raided a gambling operation that competed with the Bonanno crime family, according to federal charges. More than a decade ago, a Nassau County detective burst into a nondescript shoe repair store on Long Island, flanked by colleagues intent on shutting down a backroom gambling operation controlled by the Genovese crime family. Federal prosecutors say the detective, Hector Rosario, 51, was not on police business when he raided Sal's shoe repair in Merrick, New York, nor were the men who joined him officers. Prosecutors called them associates. The detective, prosecutors say, was secretly on the payroll of the rival Bonanno crime family, and the raid was intended to make his second boss happy. Mr. Rosario, 51, was indicted in 2022 along with 8 other defendants after a years-long investigation into the Genovese and Bonanno families' illegal gambling businesses. The 8 other defendants have all pled guilty to charges that include racketeering and running illegal gambling businesses. Mr. Rosario is charged with the obstruction of justice and lying to FBI agents who were investigating the illicit businesses, including the one prosecutors say he raided. He has pleaded not guilty. On Tuesday, opening statements began in his criminal trial before Judge Eric N. Vitellano of U.S. District Court in Brooklyn. Anna Karamigios, a federal prosecutor, said Mr. Rosario was on the Bonanno family payroll while he was a Nassau County detective. He chose the crime family over the public he swore to protect, she said. When FBI agents asked him what he knew, he lied again and again. Organized crime families like Bonanno and Genovese once exerted considerable power over unions and industries such as construction in the Northeast. But starting in the 1980s, aggressive prosecutions sapped their power, and the Bonanno family saw members convicted or cooperate with the government. Even though the family's longtime boss, Joseph C. Massino, defected, in 2011, he became the first boss of an organized crime family to cooperate with federal authorities. Federal prosecutors in Brooklyn have continued their crackdown. In 2017, 4 associates of the Bonanno and Gambino crime families were charged with selling cocaine out of a Manhattan gelato store. In 2022, prosecutors indicated that indicted Mr. Rosario and 8 other associates with the crime families. The Genovese and Bonanno gambling operations were lucrative, prosecutors say, and were nestled in the back of businesses such as the shoe repair store, a cafe, and a soccer club. Gambling revenue from the cafe alone totaled more than $10,000 per week, with proceeds coming from electronic gambling machines and card games out of sight of the store's legal customers. Mr. Rosario cracked down on the competition, prosecutors said, by visiting rival gambling dens in his capacity as a detective and conducting at least one fake raid at the shoe repair store, prosecutors said. Federal agents interviewed Mr. Rosario on January 2020. According to investigators, Mr. Rosario falsely said he never visited any gambling locations and that he had not known Salvatore Rubino, also known as Sal the Shoemaker, the owner of the raided store who ran the gambling operation for the Genovese crime family. Lou Freeman, an attorney for Mr. Rosario, said during his opening statement that the government case rested on the word of cooperating witnesses who were providing information in exchange for lighter sentences. Each of these witnesses were in organized crime, Mr. Freeman said. 2 of them were swept up in the 2017 indictment involving the gelato store. Damiano Zumo, a former soldier for the Bonanno crime family, testified on Tuesday that he, along with Sal Russo, Bonanno family associate, directed Mr. Rosario to carry out the raid on Mr. Rubino's store. According to Mr. Zumo, the Bonanno family proceeds from the operation had been hampered by competition, as well as an agreement they entered with the Genovese family to divide gambling proceeds from the Grand Cafe in Lynbrook, New York. So Mr. Rosario was enlisted to intimidate cooperating businesses, earning $150 per month for several months, Mr. Zumo testified. Mr. Freeman questioned Mr. Zumo's credibility, noting that he faced decades in prison on cocaine charges and stood to receive a lighter sentence for his cooperation with the authorities. In April, Mr. Rubino pleaded guilty to operating an illegal gambling business, and 4 other people associated with the Genovese crime family pleaded guilty to other felony charges. The next 3 months, 3 other defendants with the Bonanno family pleaded guilty to charges, leaving Mr. Rosario as the last defendant in his case. Their album is wordless. Will their protests against AI resound? Musicians including Kate Bush and Billy Ocean released a silent record in outrage at a proposed change in British copyright law. Sometimes silence speaks louder than song. That's the hope, at least, for more than 1,000 musicians who released a lyricless album on Tuesday to protest the British government's proposal to expand the ways that developers can use copyrighted protected works to train artificial intelligence models. The album, which was created by artists including Annie Lennox, Billy Ocean, Hans Zimmer, and Kate Bush, is not exactly silent. It features recordings of empty studios, which the artists say represent the impact we expect the government's proposals would have on musicians' livelihoods. There are footsteps and ruffles. Is that a door closing, a page turning, a fly? But only the most out there contemporary composers refer to the sounds as songs. Doesn't that silence says it all? Kate Bush, who contributed to the album, said in a statement, adding, "If these changes go ahead, the life's work of all the country musicians will be handed over to AI companies for free." Under the government's proposal, artists would have to opt out or reserve their rights to keep their works from being used to train AI. The window for public comments on the proposal, which is part of the broader government consultation on copyright and artificial intelligence, was set to close Tuesday night. Opt-out shifts the burden of controlling your works onto the rights holder, said Ed Newton-Rex, who organized the album as the chief executive of the Fairly Trained, a nonprofit that certifies generative AI companies for the training data they use. Basically, he said, of the current government proposal, it flips copyright on its head. Even as some artists experiment with artificial intelligence, many fear that the developers are inappropriately using their work without compensating them. Publishers and journalists are also concerned. The New York Times has sued OpenAI and Microsoft for copyright infringement of news content related to AI systems. OpenAI and Microsoft denied those claims. The album, titled Is This What We Want?, has 12 songs, each of which has a one-word title that together spells out the sentence, "The British government must not legalize music theft to benefit AI companies." Some of the artists who were part of the album project directly contributed to the audio. Mr. Newton Rest said, although he said that all shared in the credits. Mr. Newton Rex and other critics fear that artists may not even know if their work is being used to train AI models. He said that he previously run opt-out schemes at generative AI companies, which he called an illusion, in part because copyright work can spread so quickly online that creators can lose control of it. Powerful AI developers have repeatedly shown that they are willing to skirt copyright law to train systems. And Britain, desperate to revive its sluggish economy, is aggressively trying to court AI developers. Prime Minister Keir Starmer recently said he plans to push Britain to be the world leader. The country has already signaled its willingness to break with the European Union and some of its other allies like Australia and Canada in its attitude to the technology. In a similar AI summit in Paris, Britain sided with the United States in declining to sign a communique calling for AI to be inclusive and sustainable. Now Britain is arguing that a competitive copyright regime is part of what's needed to build a cutting-edge, secure, and sustainable AI infrastructure. The proposals, which were announced last year, call the current system unclear and say that this is hampering innovation for both AI developers and artists. Britain argues that the proposed changes are meant to give artists more control over the way their work is used and more opportunities for payment. In response to a request for comment, the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology said that Britain's current copyright structure is holding both artists and AI companies back from full innovation, but it also noted that no decisions have been finalized and that it would consider the responses it received before setting out next steps. Britain's consultation process, in which the government asked for public input at the early stages of policy proposals, is designed to take in feedback and other leads to revisions. As the consultation period ended on Tuesday, British artists and publishers released a series of protests. Several newspapers featured identical campaign images across their front pages that read, "Make it fair. The government wants to change the UK's laws to favour big tech platforms so they can use the British creative content." The musicians Paul McCartney, Elton John, and Dua Lipa, the novelist Kazuo Ishiguro, and the actor Stephen Fry were among the artists who signed a letter in protest that was published in the Times of London. "There's no moral or economic argument for stealing our copyright," the artist wrote. "Taking it away will devastate the industry and steal the future of the next generation." That is all that we have for today. Thank you so much for listening. Goodbye.